The Ball Theory of Christianity, based on the work of Glenn Young. Ball and Christianity, Part 4. This is based on the theory that Baal, the god portrayed in the Old Testament as the great rival god of Yahweh, whose worship was considered by the prophets as an abomination, is in fact the model for the Christ story, and Christianity is a morphed version of the Baal legend, not a reformed version of the Judaism, nor a new covenant with the God Yahweh. So we continue. Back to the real provable timeline, the new wave of invaders. 300 years after the Sea People came a new wave of invaders to the Eastern Mediterranean. 900 to 650 BC, Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian domination of Eastern Mediterranean was the fact. Reference a history of the Near East circa 3000 to 323 BC by Marenrup. This was a great political, but not so much religious shock to the entire area. So the response to the crisis was this. Phoenicia is attacked often with major defeats, but manages to stave off complete domination of the new powers, primarily those coming from the east, in this case, particularly Greek. They survive 13 years siege of the cities by the Babylonians. Phoenicia's response, she creates more support for its western Mediterranean colonies, such as Carthage, as a means for preserving their culture and maintaining support for the motherland. Quite interesting. Now, the Israelites in Judea in response to the crisis, the landlocked Yahwehs have no means of resistance nor escape over the time and wars. Reference Flavius Josephus, The Antiquities of the Jews. The minor and relatively unimportant semi-Yahwist kingdoms, Israel and Judea, are both destroyed with relatively minimal effort of the superpowers, and the rich and the powerful of people are exiled. The poor are mostly left on the land, and is in the fashion of the day. Alien settlers are brought in to occupy the land. This is a critical fact that's not considered by those who considered the Bible the only resource and the only true version of history. They do not understand that it paints very broad swaths of a point in history, but never getting into the detail. And this is where myth begins to replace actual history. This was a new style of war. The Assyrian war machine creates crisis in the land of Phoenicia and the Israelites. I think one has to have the proper perspective to understand the technology of what these empires were deploying. They were not dragging their knuckles along the ground and rubbing two sticks together to try to get a fire. These were sophisticated, cosmopolitan, advanced thinkers. Many historians would agree with the following statement. In many cases, they're far superior to us today. And with the new technology, the Assyrian Empire had accumulated and now was deploying against its enemies. Anyone who stood in its way fell victim to their technology. Now, the Yahweh's response to the crisis was this. And when I speak of crisis, understand a crisis is defined as when your culture is about to be obliterated. That meant your homeland, your belief systems, everything. So from 620 to 550 BC, Yahwists are in exile in Babylon. Free from kings and competitors, the minority prophet sect gains upper hand and creates a relatively new religion. Never thought about that story in Daniel, did you? Yeah. All right. With Yahweh as the sole God now, because remember, they're in a foreign land, they begin to rewrite the story. The wrath of Yahweh destroyed the kingdoms, the invaders unwillingly tools of God. How many times have you heard that? Well, yes, they died. Shame, but it was God's will. And the ones that brought it, well, they were doing the will of God. How many times? It goes back, folks, thousands and thousands and thousands of years. I continue. And a host of daily living and worship activities that, if not followed precisely, were punishable by death. Where else do we hear of that today? The belief was, if not all people conformed, all people were at risk of a new wrath of God. The prophets used the destruction to their advantage. Most importantly, the prophet faction gave an answer to why Yahweh let his nations be destroyed and his temple flattened. The prophet faction declared, it was all Yahweh's doing as punishment for failure to comply with Yahweh's laws and mandates. The chief violation that most angered God was following Baal and the practice of human sacrifice. However, the very worship of Yahweh required blood sacrifices. And as you and all of us now know, the very religions themselves are all based upon human sacrifice. From Christianity to Judaism to Islam, all the way down the line. It's just what history is. It was from here, while in exile in Babylon, that the followers of Yahweh's became Jews. Now, what most people who read the Bible and follow it as their only source, what they're not understanding is that there is a transformation taking place of a culture of people. This is now the fourth rendition. Yes, the fourth of a race of people, a culture of people. They were at one time known as the Abramites. Then they became known as the Hebrews. Then the children of Israel, Israelites. Now they are becoming Jews. The holy books, the Old Testament, were rewritten with clear anti-human sacrifice, vent, and codified. Now, think about this. When Babylon came in and destroyed the temple and took out all the nation's treasures, including the sacred writings, this was the beginning of the race of people known as the Jews. It was here where the Jews saw human sacrifice as a source of the past and potentially future wrath of God. Not all the text was cleaned up. God saying all that first came out of the matrix was his firstborn. But the Abraham story was changed to keep Isaac from being sacrificed. It would have been appalling had you could have gone into Sunday school and saw that picture of Abraham taking up the child Isaac, which we learned last time is not true. He was a grown man. He died up there. But it would have been appalling had that been the case. So you have to rewrite the narrative in order to fit the story. So human sacrifice or anything akin to it became the infamy of the Jews now. This was their banner. How dare you have a religion like that? But the problem is, even their kings practiced it. The most evil of the kings. Here's the signet ring of the king Manasseh, whose 50-year reign was the cause of the destruction of Judea and his use of human sacrifices. And this is what the prophets used for the destruction. So you have to understand, with the people of this time and this era, human sacrificing was very normal. It was very holy. All right. So with the Baalists, there wasn't any such crisis yet. While the new invaders did obtain control over Phoenicia, unlike the followers of Yahweh, most of the major cities of Baal survived the wars. And as the east was invaded, the followers of Baal expanded their influence in the central and western parts of the Mediterranean. So for the followers of Baal, unlike those of Yahweh, there were no problems, no major crisis of faith yet. The Jews return, 550 to 325 BC. Persia dominates the eastern Mediterranean with Phoenicia as the major ally, and the Phoenician navies playing a major role in the wars of the Greeks. Remember, the Phoenicians were the seafarers. They were the experts. I mean, it's like this. If you were needing a subcontractor to do a job, well, you'd want the best. Well, in this case, why destroy a culture when you could actually use that culture to your advantage? And that's exactly what Medo-Persia did. So Cyrus the Great, called the Messiah in the Hebrew Bible, allows the peoples to return and rebuild their temples, including the Judeans. Here began the beginnings of the future civil wars among the tribes. As a result of captivity, there was now 4 schisms who called themselves the true Hebrews. So, as you can see, here's where history begins to delve into the details. You've ever heard the axiom that says, the devil's in the details? Well, it's because when you start digging in here, you begin to look at the real history. Now, if you read the book of Nehemiah, Nehemiah was the wine bearer of the king of Persia. And we get the story from Nehemiah's point of view of him returning back into the area known as Judea. It's desolated. Those that did not go into captivity, folks, it only takes 2 generations to be completely changed, to be completely altered in your beliefs and the way that you see things. We're talking here hundreds of years. Yet, most try to have this seamless connection to what they read and think is history to what actually was happening on the ground, so to speak. So the major Persian influence. What can't be told and detailed here is the great influence on religion that came from the Persian Empire. Why it's so hard to comprehend that when a land and its people are conquered by invaders, very seldom is there anything left of that culture. The whole concept of dualism, of heaven and hell, existence of the devil, of resurrection of all the dead, and many other new ideas which influence all the religions of the area, including the Jews, are mainly Persian in origin or redesign. As just and mild rulers, the views of the Persians were widely accepted by many people. Christian church history blocks the masses from knowing the actual historical facts. Here is what's happening, folks. And the one that really did this very well was Alexander the Great. It's called Hellenism. This is what has happened. It's happened to every culture, every religion, every belief system. There's so much imported from Persia and so much forgotten. Persian imagery, that is the precursor of the Christian Trinity. Look at this. There's your Trinity. There it is. The human teacher and the God of all that is good. Now, this was at least 600 years before even the supposed Christ story took place. The Jews return. Persia allows the Yahweh's cult to return to Judea, to rebuild their temple, and to establish a colony of believers. A colony. Many people get this idea that there was this mass return. No. Less than 10% of the Jews returned to Judea. And think about what they faced. They now had to face the competitors, those who were left behind. They've multiplied, they have the lands, and now you've got the forgotten brethren coming, and it isn't this huge mass. You getting it? Then the reason why 90% did not return, because life in Babylon was considered safe and free and the center of the world. The great thing about the Jewish culture is that they are great merchants, have been. And what a great natural ability to understand commerce. Economist. During its history, the colony is mostly small and a failure with harsh enforcement of the new rules. Go to the book of Ezra. You can see that. It was, well, no different than what we would see in many religions today, with their strict adherence to the very dot and tittle of the law. So what happens now? Well, we know the script. What's going to happen? It happens all over the world, the same thing. Division within the Jews. 4 major divisions of Jews at the time. Now, this is about 450 BC. The returnees with the new religion are running into a problem. Those who stayed in Babylon with the new religion, but far more wealthy and cosmopolitan than the returnees. So you have this exemption rule. You've got the wealthy, yes, we abide by the rules, but we don't follow them because they don't apply to us. Now, those who fled to Egypt at the time of the conquest mostly keep the old religion, but influenced by the new religion. Those who had remained in Judea at the time of conquest mostly keep the old tradition. This fourth group gave the new Jews a lot of trouble when they showed up in the old land of Canaan. And you can see how the confusion can begin and did set in. There were the new rules coming from the Yahwist out of the captivity of Babylon, who are now rewrote the tenets of the faith. We have to remember again, when Nebuchadnezzar came in, as the real history records, the Jews, or what we would call back then, the Israelites, lost their religion. They lost their books. They lost everything. It was taken away. And you can begin to see how that begins to rewrite a perception of history. And while all this is going, Baal is still growing. During this time, 600 to 450 BC, the followers of Baal continue to be relatively successful in the world of superpowers. Phoenicia becomes a valued vassal of Persia, the Persian Empire, and greatly prospers. Why? If you are the trade route, guess what? Gold is going to be filling your pockets very quickly. Carthage reaches the height of power, defeating Greek in Sicily. Anyone study Patton? Patton was a great studier of Carthage. He knew the Phoenicians, knew them intimately. He knew their strategies, their styles. After some 1,500 years in the Mediterranean, it was still mostly a Baalist region. With rising Greek competition, Hellenism began to influence the belief systems. But in what must have seemed like a flash, the Baalist world finally collapsed before an invader. In 325 to 150 BC, Hellenistic Greek-Roman conquers the eastern Mediterranean and starts cultural domination of the area. Phoenicia suffers great defeats and loses trading control of the Greeks. Her homeland cities destroyed and repopulated with Greeks. Phoenician remnants, including Carthage, put far greater efforts in Western Mediterranean, including Spain. However, Phoenicia, Carthage, loses the Punic Wars with Rome. An end of an era has come. Phoenicia is Hellenized. Carthage destroyed. Spain and other regions of Phoenicia influence are now occupied by Rome. 3,000 plus years of domination by Phoenicia and the Canaanites in an almost total destruction. And this brings yet another kind of war, of a young man who had an army that began the conquest of the world. Alexander's army did in 8 months what the Babylonians could not do in 13 years. He took and conquered Tyre. It was a major defeat for the entire cultural belief system of the area. Now, too late, the Baalist believers face a crisis of faith. Why have, after so long, had their homeland and colonies been destroyed? What was it that they had failed to do to please their gods? Why were they now slaves to this new world order? Had they sacrificed too little or too much, or the wrong thing? Finding friends in destruction. In the region of the Lake of the Gennesaret, or the Sea of Galilee, as it's known, there is no sea, the Baalist survivors and the remnant of the poor Jews not taken into exile and not really part of the Jewish reforms of Babylon live together. It is from this area that the first concepts of Christianity came into being. Both groups, the Baalist and the old Jews, in the state of flux and religious confusion, were influenced by other groups, the Greeks and later the Romans and the Persians, and now the new Jews returning from exile. But both groups looked for means of maintaining their core beliefs. This area was the melting pot of the new and old religions of East and West. To these people, the new Jews were new oppressors, only being conquered and then being forced to convert to Judaism about 100 years before Christ. Out of Galilee came yet another retelling of an old story, taking elements from all the old and the new religions with a major focus on a key rite of Baalism. And the retelling became what is known today as Christianity. This is the end of part 4.